Does Hollywood love the Bible or does it hate the Bible? Does Hollywood love Christians or does it hate Christians? Let me tell you, there's been some ups and downs over the years, and it's interesting when you go back and trace the history of the Bible's impact on Hollywood. We're going to do that today, so stay tuned. Hi, I'm Phil Cook, and thanks so much for joining us on this podcast episode. You know, a number of months ago, Jeff Kloa, who's the Chief Curatorial Officer at the Museum of the Bible, called me up and said, I'd like to do a podcast on Hollywood's relationship with the Bible. So we had a really interesting conversation on the podcast at the Museum of the Bible. I'd encourage you to go check it out. The Museum of the Bible has been a client of ours at Cook Media Group for a long time. We love Steve Green all the way down. Everybody that's been a part of that museum has just been fantastic, and we're so grateful for the partnership we have. But I thought today I'd pull some of those notes from my conversation with Jeff on his podcast and talk a little more detail about just how the relationship between Hollywood and the Bible has grown and been up and down. You know, it's kind of interesting. And in fact, the world has always been fascinated with stories from the Bible. You know, you remember in the days of the early church through the Middle Ages, pageants, plays, what we call miracle and mystery plays, were a vital part of church life. They were, you know, it was largely an illiterate culture, an illiterate society back then. And so plays, big musical pageant events were a big way to tell the story of the Bible. And so in those days, almost every church, particularly big cathedrals, would do these what we call miracle and mystery plays, and they would go out from the church. They were so big, they traveled all over Europe. In fact, I'm getting ready next month to go to an interesting by the time you see this, I'll have already done it, but I'm going to the Oberammergau Passion Play in Oberammergau, Germany. And it's a fantastic, it's like a 7-8 hour play. It's one of the last major passion plays in the world at that scale. It happens once every 10 years, started in 1633. And the myth, the story, is that in those days, during the days of the Black Plague, a traveler from their village had been out, came in, traveling on a trip. He came into their village and he had the Black Plague. And he was dying, and the church leaders and the city leaders, the town village leaders panicked. They got together, they had a prayer service. They basically told God, look, if you'll protect us from the Black Plague, we'll do this passion play every 10 years. And they've been faithful. They've done it. And the story goes that no one in the village caught the plague after that, and they've been committed to honoring that. So there's been a few years, you know, there's been some church, a few times the church blocked the play because it was extremely anti-Semitic for a while, which is kind of interesting. When they made the Jewish people the bad guys, they really made them the bad guys. Those Jewish leaders were super bad guys. In fact, Hitler loved the Passion Play in the 40s. And so during various times, the churches tried to be corrective on that. And they finally, I think, got it right. But then during World War I and World War II, it was actually delayed or canceled because of bombings, invasions, things like that. So, but it's only been a handful of times over the years. Since 1633, every 10 years, they've been faithful about doing this. And there's about 5,000 people, I understand, in the village of Oberammergau, and literally about 2,500 of them are involved in the play. So you have to be a member, you have to be a citizen, you have to live in that town to do it. It's just been passed down from generation to generation. So it's a good example of how the church for a long time loved it. Now the Reformation came along, and the Reformation kind of was so focused on the scripture, they wanted to get rid of Christian objects and art and plays and things like that. So thousands of Christian art objects were destroyed during the Reformation throughout Europe because they were just a little over-enthusiastic about sticking to the text, which was admirable, but they destroyed priceless works of Christian art. And suddenly plays fell out of favor, and that went on through, even in America, the founding of America, the Puritans did not have they did not like plays very much. They did not think very highly of actors. They had a code that they didn't want actors or plays to be any part of what they have done. But over the years, it's really, really interesting. Over the years, that has been corrected. In fact, historians will tell you, film historians will tell you that in the very early days of the film industry, between roughly 1898 and 1914, the historians will tell you the church made more movies than Hollywood. which is kind of interesting. I mean, they made all kinds of films. I've got some posters in my living room from some of those early silent films. In fact, I was doing some consulting with a church in New Jersey a number of years ago, and they wanted to put their local services on TV. It was a historic church that was built in about 1910. Henry Emerson Fosdick, I believe, was the founding pastor. And they wanted to honor the historical architecture and structure of the church, and they asked me to come in and give them some advice for how to install cameras and do those kind of things and what they should be thinking about. And we needed to expand a back wall of the sanctuary to do it. And they opened up the wall, and to their shock, they found a giant vintage 35 millimeter film projector embedded inside the wall. Nobody knew it was there up until that moment. And they did some research, and they discovered that back in the turn of the century, the last century, 1915, 1920, they would have movie nights at the church. And they had a giant, this 35 millimeter movie projector installed in the church, and they would open the sanctuary to show all kind of evangelistic movies, family movies, just all adventure movies, all kind of movies from that period. So in those early days, the church really embraced Hollywood, and that's been true of churches all over the country during that time. But in the 30s, 40s, 50s, as Hollywood embraced more violence, more sexuality, smoking, drinking, moral issues like that, the church pulled back. And the Catholic Church actually created what's called the Hays Code. And in those days, they actually hired a layman to go in and create a code to try to guide Hollywood on the kind of films they should be making. And that's why, the vestiges of that code, although it didn't last a long time, the kind of the vestiges, the legacy of that code went into the 60s and 70s. I grew up in the 60s watching I Love Lucy. And even though Lucy and Desi were married, they slept in separate twin beds. Even though they had kids, little Ricky, remember? I think it was true on Green Acres and some other shows at that time. Married couples slept in separate beds, and that was largely the legacy of the Hays Code. They wouldn't allow smoking on camera. They wouldn't allow drinking. You could have, in a Western, you could have a drink sitting there, but they really discouraged it from being actually consumed on camera. So it's been a really, a love-hate relationship. So in the 70s, the 80s, the church really had very little to do. Now, there were filmmakers like Martin Scorsese, who actually, even though he didn't make explicit Christian films, he studied to be a seminary student. In fact, I have a quote, "I wanted to be a priest. My whole life has been nothing but movies and religion. That's it, nothing else." So Martin Scorsese and others have had a really remarkable religious sensibility about them in their films. If you study them, you really see a lot of morality played in and out of those films, and it's quite interesting. And, of course, earlier than that, back in the turn of the last century, people like Cecil B. DeMille, the great director who did the Ten Commandments and other big epics, he said, "Give me any 2 pages of the Bible, and I'll give you a picture." He just believed the Bible was such a powerful source of stories that it was really, really quite amazing. And when David Putnam came along and produced Chariots of Fire, he said, "Making films solely for entertainment is like making soup with only one ingredient." It's interesting how filmmakers have looked at the Bible over the years and seen the power. A guy named K.S. Hoover back in 1911 said, "The moving picture machine has become a preacher, and its sermons are most effective because they are addressed to the eye rather than the ear." So over the years, we've seen a love-hate relationship up and down with Hollywood. And it was really The Passion of the Christ, the big epic film by Mel Gibson, that changed everything in Hollywood here in the most, in the modern era. I think Hollywood was so shocked that there were people out there who take their faith seriously and want to see entertainment and media that treats faith seriously. They were just stunned at the number of people that went to see that film. They actually call it passion dollars. The money they made from that movie was so incredibly significant. But today in Hollywood, there's a really interesting conversation going on between the Bible and movies. You see things like Hacksaw Ridge, another Mel Gibson film about Ronnie Doss, the Congressional Medal of Honor winner during World War II in the Pacific, and his heroic actions. And he was a dedicated Christian. He was a Seventh-day Adventist, dedicated Christian man. And he did it because of his spiritual motivations. Bruce Almighty, which is a comedy, but it's a really interesting look at a guy who is so frustrated at God, his career is crashing, his family is crashing, and he says, "You know what? If I just had your power, I could fix everything." And so essentially, Morgan Freeman, who played God, said, "Fine, take it, take my power, you got it." And for about a week, He played God, and he did a horrible, horrible job and messed it all up, and he finally realized why he's who he is and God's who he is. And if you haven't seen the film Bruce Almighty, I'd encourage you to do it. It's a really interesting movie. But even in movies like X-Men, you see traces of biblical morals. You see traces of biblical stories. You see forgiveness and redemption. In so many movies, if you open yourself up to it, you'll see a remarkable number of biblical features, and there's no question the Bible's had an impact. Now, what's really interesting to me is back in the 30s and 40s, the West was immersed in the Bible. Everybody read the Bible in school, and it makes me recall a great story from Christopher Hitchens, the great author, who was an atheist. But he wrote an amazing story in Vanity Fair, and it was about an incident that happened at Dunkirk during World War II. If you remember, during World War II, at the very early stages of the war, Britain really wasn't ready. So when they went into France to fight the Nazis, they were pretty much obliterated, and the Nazis were pushing them back to the beach. Christopher Nolan has done an interesting film on it more recently, but they were pushed back to the beach, and pretty much all hope was lost. And Winston Churchill and the British High Command radioed the commander on the beach at their darkest moment, radioed the commander on the beach and said, "Can you make it? What's the story? What's going on?" And he sent back 3 words. He telegraphed 3 words: "But if not." And he got it. Those 3 words came from the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you may remember, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, said, everybody at the sound of the horn and the trumpet and the lyre, you have to bow down and worship my image. And these 3 dedicated Jewish young men said, no, we're not going to do that. And they were willing to go to their death to not worship a false god. And when when Nebuchadnezzar called him in, they said, "We're not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." It was the King James Bible in a culture that had been immersed in the King James Bible that made that moment possible. And what happened was when he telegraphed those 3 words, "But if not," back to the British High Command, they all knew he was not going to give up. He was not going to succumb. He was not going to bow down to the Nazis. He was going to fight till the end. And they got so inspired by that. That's when the flotilla was sent over. That's when Churchill said, send the boats, send private boats, fishing boats, yachts, military boats, whatever we've got, send everything you can. And it was one of the great rescues of all time. And it all came about because it was a culture. I mean, can you imagine today in the Middle East or some other war zone in the world, if a commander radioed back, "But if not," to American military leadership, they'd have no clue what he was talking about. But in that world of the 20th century, in a world that was so immersed in the King James Bible, they had one vocabulary, one source of collective wisdom, and they understood it completely. I just think that's a fact. And for an atheist like Christopher Hitchens to tell that story, I think is really, really remarkable. So the truth is, Hollywood is continuing. And one of the things I think is worth mentioning and encouraging you to check out is the Hollywood Prayer Network. Karen Covell, longtime friend, my wife Kathleen is on the board of the Hollywood Prayer Network. She founded the Hollywood Prayer Network with a purpose of helping Christians understand that Hollywood is not the enemy. It's a mission field. Instead of constantly criticizing and boycotting and getting upset with Hollywood, what if we started praying for them? What if we started treating them like a mission field and started really praying that God would turn things around, and also start sending missionaries out here? Start sending young filmmakers and actors and writers and directors and producers out here to Hollywood to make an impact. So there are things happening, and I would say there are Christians and very highly placed positions in Hollywood that are quietly making a difference from the inside. So there's no question that over the years, Christians in Hollywood have had a love-hate relationship, but I think there's great opportunity to turn things around. I mean, remember, film is a powerful, powerful thing. And in today's world of streaming with Amazon Prime and Disney Plus and Netflix, now is the time more than ever, I think, to get our message of hope out there on some of those streaming platforms. And so I would encourage you, engage with today's culture, engage with Hollywood, watch some movies, see what's out there. It's easy to Google a list of the most famous Christian movies out there and go check them out. For the ones you haven't seen, go watch them and check them out. I would also encourage you to be a patron. Think of the people that are trying to make a difference in Hollywood. So let me tell you 3 or 4 reasons Hollywood has always been fascinated with the Bible. Number one, it's the power of the stories. Since the early days of the King James translation of the Bible, the majesty of those stories has been incredible. I told you that quote by Cecil B. DeMille, give me any 2 pages of the Bible and I'll give you a picture. There's so many stories, and many that haven't been shot, haven't been done. I talked to a producer in Australia just recently who's just shot a feature film on the book of Job. Not the most positive thing in the world, but it's a powerful, powerful story, and he's done a brilliant job. So much of the Bible that has yet to be filmed that we could be filming. So just think about the impact of the Bible on the culture. People still resonate. Sometimes we say we're living on the fumes of a religious culture, a Christian culture here in America, for sure, and throughout the West. Number 2, audience awareness. There's so many best-selling books throughout history that have reflected Christian values. I was thinking, there's a list. Number 1 is The Imitation of Christ. Think of that book. That's been written, that was 1418, and currently it's the best-selling Christian book of all time other than the Bible. The Book of Common Prayer, Pilgrim's Progress, Fox's Book of Martyrs, Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, Ben-Hur, The Late Great Planet Earth, In His Steps. There's so many Christian books that have reached millions and millions. Lord of the Rings has reached 150 million in sales. Think about that. Pilgrim's Progress, 250 million copies have been sold. So these Christian books have been huge in the culture out there. The third thing would be so many of these stories transcend culture. They work no matter where you are in history, throughout history. And I look at organizations like Christian Vision, who does yesheis.com. They've done little shorts, video shorts. They have offices around the world creating short, biblically based videos to help people share Christ. Go to yesheis.com or Google Christian Vision, and you can see exactly what they're doing. The Jesus Film Project went from doing a feature film on Jesus to creating a library of short films. They're doing both now, and it's a way to share the gospel in short videos. So those stories can be used in so many cultures, and the Jesus film has been translated into about 2,000 languages, if not more by now. So it's just amazing how that works. And the fourth thing, the fourth thing I think is the size. We forget the size of the Christian audience. We'd have to combine the audience for NBC Nightly News, the Associated Press, the Christian Science Monitor, 3 or 4, news organizations to even come close to the size of the Christian audience. We saw that with Passion of the Christ. We saw just how huge the audience is of people who take their faith seriously. Certainly not all are super dedicated Christians, but they want to see content, movies, television programming that takes their faith serious. So let me tell you, if you're interested in doing this, if you're a filmmaker interested in stepping out and maybe stepping into this arena and taking the gospel into media in some capacity, movies, television programs, streaming content, whatever, let me give you some suggestions. Let me give you 4 or 5 ideas here. Number 1, learn to listen to the voices of pop culture. Sometimes we get so in our bubble, we forget to engage with what's happening out there. And we need to be a part of the pop culture conversation. If God chose to speak through a warmongering Chaldean in the Old Testament, or a donkey, or a burning bush, he could speak through pop culture. God is out there doing things that we don't know anything about because we're not engaging into the culture that exists today. In fact, the singer Bono said, "Stop asking God to bless what you're doing and find out what God is doing, because it's already blessed." Start listening to those voices in pop culture. Also recognize the opportunity. Postmoderns don't approach life as a problem to be solved. It's a mystery to be experienced and lived. My friend, filmmaker Craig Detweiler said, "Poets will prevail in an age of information overload. Artists will be vitally important to slowing us down." I'll tell you, there's a role for artists. There's a role for creative people. It's one of the reasons I wrote my book, Ideas on a Deadline, How to Be Creative When the Clock is Ticking. There's more pressure than ever to deliver important, significant, great creative content. And this is a book that'll help you learn how to do it. I remember Martin Scorsese's more recent movie, Silence, about the missionaries that went to Japan. hundreds of years ago, and the horrible, horrible journey and difficulty that was. There are just so many ways that if we recognize the opportunities out there, we could step into that flow. A third thing is be real. You know, this generation obviously values authenticity more than just about anything. Again, Craig Detweiler said, this generation wants Jesus unplugged, complete with the radical claims, unexplainable miracles, and a savage, bloody death. Don't try to dress it up. Be absolutely real. I think that's so very important. I was at a book signing years ago with a number of different authors. One of the authors was a woman who wrote Amish fiction. And it's super popular. I mean, it's the number one at the time, may still be. At the time, it was the number one Christian fiction category, Amish fiction, basically life on the Amish farm. And I picked up one of her books and read through it. And I'm not dissing anybody, but it was not very realistic based on what really happens out there in life. But people love it. But we've got to get away from that. We've got to get into a really serious place. So read your Amish fiction, enjoy it, that's fine. But when it comes to making films that a bigger audience is going to really embrace, particularly a secular audience, we have to be really true and authentic in what we do. And number 4, engage with today's culture, even when it's uncomfortable. I'm telling you, there are filmmakers trying. I remember Darren Aronofsky, who did the Noah movie. Obviously, there were problems with that movie. You know, you had the world being decimated by a global flood. We didn't really need the rock people. If you saw it, you remember that. But Christians really railed against that movie, but it was a guy trying to tell a Bible story. And I also talked to the American Bible Society during the time that was in theaters, and they said the story that people walk in off the street and requesting the Noah story. They want to find out more about it. A movie like that draws people. I asked the YouVersion Bible team during the time the movie was in theaters. They said the Noah story was accessed more online in the YouVersion Bible, different versions of the Bible, than any other story during that time. So it intrigued people. So even when it's uncomfortable, I think we have to understand what's called common grace. You look at movies like Hidden Figures or Blind Side, or The Book of Eli is a great example. It's not explicitly Christian. It doesn't lead to the salvation moment, but I'll tell you, there's tons of what we call common grace in there. God at work in people's lives. So learn to embrace these things even when they're a bit uncomfortable. I think that's why I love Karen Covell at the Hollywood Prayer Network so much. And number 5, be a patron. I talked about this earlier. Maybe you have a young man or woman in your church that wants to be a filmmaker. Support them. Maybe you could help them, pay for their film school, pay for their training, help support them in some way, or help pay for their transition and their trip out here and help fund what they're doing, buy them a car. There's so many ways we could be patrons for people who are interested in making an impact with the gospel in today's media-driven culture. We launched the Influence Lab for that very reason. You can go to influencelab.com. My wife has a division of it called Influence Women. And she's out here to mentor, inspire, teach, train women who are professionals in the industry. And she's got a great group here in Hollywood that she ministers to constantly. She's just launched a new group in Atlanta, and she's launching another one in Nashville. By the time you see this, that may be underway. So those are ways that you could get involved. If you're in one of those cities, reach out to us and let us know how you would like to be involved or help support the effort. It takes money to make these meetings happen and bring in professionals to teach, train, mentor. Now, we're also doing it internationally. So I would just encourage you, you could be a patron and help people who are out here trying to make a difference in sharing the gospel through the media. And trust me, they don't have to do it explicitly. Not every movie has to be a Christian film. It just needs to be a great film. It needs to be a good film and have redemptive values, have moral values in it. That's the way I think we'll eventually shift this culture. People aren't going to be interested in going to, remember the old Billy Graham films, which are great efforts, but no matter, the joke was no matter how difficult the hero went through, he came bruised and bleeding and stumbling into a Billy Graham crusade at the end and accepted Christ. Well, that was for a period. But today, those kind of movies aren't going to make a big impact. But we could make amazing movies of all kinds that just point the way to salvation. So I just think that if you get involved, I think it would be fantastic. The Museum of the Bible has a great tribute to how film and media have used the Bible over the years. I'd encourage you to go visit the Museum of the Bible if you're ever in Washington, D.C. It's breathtaking experience, and I'd encourage you to go. And I appreciate you being part of this and this episode. And so, thanks for watching. I talk about a variety of things on here, but it's mostly focused on faith, media, and culture. And I want to build up an army of people who are interested in engaging today's culture with the power of the Bible, but through professional expertise in media excellence. That's really our goal. And remember my book, Ideas on a Deadline, How to Be Creative When the Clock is Ticking. I'd encourage you to order that today. If you don't have it yet, this could really change your creative future. The techniques, tips, research, experiences in this book are absolutely amazing. I'm hearing so many great things from people who are reading it. Get the book and get it for your team. It'll really help you accelerate having breakthrough ideas in your team, your organization, your company. It's so important. And remember, give us a rating. Share this. If you know people who have asked you questions about movies and Hollywood and what's going on out there, share this with them because it could make a great difference for them and be a real help. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next episode.